I'm Patricia Thaine, co-founder of Private AI, and this is the Data Frontier podcast. Here we explore the frontier of data innovation where unstructured data meets real-world applications. Each episode brings together builders, engineers, data scientists, product leaders, and domain experts who are shaping the future of intelligence systems. From NLP and privacy to interoperability and AI-driven workflows, we unpack the tools, challenges, and breakthroughs transforming raw data into smarter systems, faster insights, and better solutions. Tariq, Chenjerai, thrilled to have you both on the Data Frontier podcast. Thank you so much for coming. Would you kick us off, Chenjerai, with an introduction of yourself?
Thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Chenjerai Sisimayi, and I'm based in Zimbabwe. I'm a Zimbabwean, and I've been working in the development space for the past 20 plus years, mainly as a development consultant, working a lot with the bilateral organizations and multilaterals. And I'm a public health specialist, background in epidemiology, and also pursuing doctoral studies in applied mathematics with the University of Johannesburg. So my research has really been focused on the application of AI in health and also health-related aspects beyond epidemiology, health financing, health system strengthening related aspects. And I'm really glad to be here and happy to share some of the experiences we've had in this field. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Tariq Khokhar. I'm the head of data for science and health at the Wellcome Trust. And for folks who don't know what that is, we're a philanthropic foundation based in the UK and that supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. My career actually has some overlaps with Chenjerai as well. I'm also a mathematician by training, but went more in the kind of computer science direction. Spent a while in industry, but I also ended up about 15 years ago at the World Bank. And there I saw huge opportunities for applying data and technology to all sorts of interesting problems in the public and social sectors. And for the last 6 or so years, I've been working in this philanthropic foundation, the Wellcome Trust, really trying to understand what are the highest leverage things we can do with data and digital technologies like AI to improve healthcare for everyone, not just in wealthy countries where I'm speaking to you from the UK. Today we have our fair share of problems when it comes to healthcare, but the reality is the population as a whole is pretty well looked after. That's not the case in much of the world, and we want to change that. Thanks.
Could you both give us a bit of an overview of the kind of data that you use and the kind of problems that you solve when it comes to these frontier problems for dealing with healthcare access inequality and accessibility in general?
Sure. Within the space of supporting the health sector and looking at it from the health system strengthening point of view, there's a lot of data routinely collected within the systems. We note that several countries have actually progressed in terms of putting in place the sort of infrastructure for routine data collection. We have DHIS2, the district health information systems that are there. So there's a lot of data that comes through. And then there's data that comes through from the periodic surveys that are done. And basically with this data, beyond obviously the traditional statistical analysis that is applied, I think an interesting area for me has been really looking at how we can build predictive models based on this data. So for the past 10 or so years, I think I've really been seized with this idea of really going for extended analysis and actually building advanced machine learning models with making use of the data so that they can provide insights and we can have some anticipatory actions for some of this data. But that said, I think the last 5 years was very fascinating for me because I then delved into the whole space of image analysis. And basically, this is where we're coming in with the deep learning, and the AI is really being applied in terms of use of AI for classification of COVID-19, of TB, based on the chest X-ray images. And so that was really eye-opening for me from the research itself, but also looking at how applicable this can be within the context of resource-limited settings. So often we do have that exposure to really curated data sets that are provided through the various competitions. But my interest really was to say, how can we make this really applicable within the resource-limited settings, where at times the data, the chest X-ray data might not actually be of good quality and might actually dispersed, might not be as much. And so this is where I found myself really focusing more of in terms of developing classification models that have pipelines that allow for good performance of these models by using techniques that are modern, and then make sure that they are documented, that also incorporated within a clinical decision support system so that they can be applied in the real world. I think that's one of the most critical aspects for me, that it's not only about model development, but really translating that into policy and real applications on the ground. So I think those are some of the areas that I've focused on in terms of the routine data, as well as also some of these deep learning models and kind of creating hybrid models that can be used within resource limited settings.
That's fascinating, Chenjerai. And actually, I'll come to TB and TB diagnostics at the end of my point, but I'll answer Patricia's question first, which is what kind of data do we see and think about in our work? So if I stick to the UK to start with, when it comes to creating health products and interventions that are going to really improve lives, we start really at the research end of things. So one type of data that we think about a lot is sort of foundational life sciences and biological data. So for example, I sit on the board of an organization called the UK Biobank, which 20-something years ago recruited 500,000 participants in the UK. Cross-section across society. And for the last 20-something years, we've followed their lives. And we have really rich and deep multi-omic data on all these folks. So after 20 or 25 years, as you can imagine, you can suddenly understand the trajectory of disease. And now, for example, earlier this year or late last year, researchers at a university in China collaborating with a university in the UK discovered these early markers for dementia, which is the kind of signal that you can imagine being turned into a diagnostic tool further down the line as well. So we really think those sorts of foundational research data become really important when it comes to long-term health interventions and health intervention product development. The second type of data has historically really been underutilized, and that's operational data. So, you mentioned as well sort of the health records and the patient records that you see that are typically captured by GPs in hospitals to largely remember what they said and what they did to a patient, but that turns into a electronic, ticker tape of everything that's happened to a person in their healthcare trajectory. So these data combined with testing data and whatnot also become a very valuable picture into the trajectory of health. But actually my favorite my favorite quote, I'm not a health guy, as I shared in my background, but my favorite quote about health was by a gentleman called Michael Marmot, who, led a whole bunch of this work in the UK. But his quote is, every minister is a health minister. And I like to think like all data are health data, because you can find out just as much about someone's health from education data, social welfare data, economic data, all these sorts of things. So we really think about all those sorts of data sets as part of the data that tells you about the social determinants of health as well. And maybe then to just come back to your point, Chenjerai, if I now turn my attention to what are the opportunities we see in low and middle income countries for delivering healthcare, clearly there's like a workforce gap that has to be filled somehow. And tools like computer-assisted diagnostics, clinical decision support systems are very powerful potential solutions to close that gap. But, when you mentioned TB diagnostics, to my knowledge, there have only been a handful of rigorous evaluations or trials of these tools. So the CAD for TB tool that Wellcome actually funded the evaluation of it in Malawi is one example. But right now we're living in a world where lots of people are proposing AI for healthcare solutions, but none of them have actually been demonstrated to, in the long term, improve patient outcomes. And for me, that's the same as, giving someone some drug and saying, please take this, it'll be good for you, without having any testing or evaluation done about it. So I'm curious if you see that gap in rigorous evaluation of not just do these things work, but are they good value for money in the long term, and how do they actually interact with systems in the long run?
You bring a very interesting point, and I think it's really critical for us to sort of emphasize that the designs of most of the programs that are rolled out in the countries, it's important to integrate your impact evaluation designs as well. And when we have such initiatives, I think it's important that already by way of rolling out this entire testing and piloting, you already have a design that is actually going to assess the effectiveness of these initiatives, and also be in a position to really pick up any unintended consequences of these initiatives. Now, it comes up in different forms. So there are some applications that are coming through to really sort of provide some efficiencies in the pipeline of doing some work. And some are really looking at enhancing knowledge of maybe, for example, school teachers or those who are providing assistance to, or the health workers, for example, who are providing services out there. Now, what's important, there are already frameworks that are there to assess the effectiveness of any training, for example, the Kirkpatrick's model. It'll be important that one can already look at, okay, we want to provide this app that is going to allow for continued learning and exposure by the health workers to the guidelines and so forth through a chatbot, for example. But it's important to look at all the various levels of assessment in terms of seeing whether the process itself is the tool appropriate for the purpose. And you also want to look at knowledge gain. You also want to look at change in practice. And then you also want to look at the effect at the end beneficiary. So that's a framework that can be used. So it's important that when we're looking at the technology itself, it's actually coupled with also frameworks to assess their effectiveness. And when you look at especially the areas of diagnostics, this is a pretty much of a sensitive area indeed, because you might actually find yourself creating more problems than what you were actually intending. So in addition to assessing the effectiveness of this, I think it's important to also have a policy on what is the decision rule. So is it really looking at the end diagnostics of this? Or you're basically saying you're screening so that at least you're now channeling the radiologists to be in a position to then further look at those that are highly likely to be having that particular outcome. So the decision rule is also very important and should be also part of the pipeline of assessing the impact and effectiveness of these initiatives.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think whenever we find a problem where someone's proposing, let's use an AI tool to help with clinical decision support or diagnostics, the usual heuristic we use is there just some sort of procedural checklist you can use to solve this problem, rather than putting an AI in the middle of it? Because, clinicians and health systems know how to use checklists, and maybe they're not, 101% accurate, but like a pretty accurate tool is often better than a tool you don't know how it's going to behave. Two other dimensions of this came to mind, Chenjerai, as you were speaking. One was how is the UK thinking about this? But then also your point about learning and capacity development of healthcare workers is an interesting one. So in the UK, the biggest clinical trial of an AI tool that we're running at the moment is called the EDITH trial. And that's a trial looking to integrate AI-assisted mammography into the NHS, the National Health Service. And that kicked off earlier this year. We'll have 700,000 folks as participants. And as you were sort of alluding to, the outcome that they're trying to measure is the AI better than a radiologist, which, at this point it probably is. But will the AI give you better 3-year health outcomes than the current state of the art? That's what they're kind of measuring. But crucially, the second thing they're measuring is efficiency gains. So right now it takes 6 people to administer 1 mammogram end to end in the UK. They want to get that down to 1 person instead. So that's what that trial is measuring. And for me, that's the way you want to construct these sorts of evaluations. But also it's all of the interesting unintended consequences that you want to keep an eye on the kind of unintended consequences. The only paper I found about this is by a chap called Yuichi Mori that was published like a month ago. He was asking the question, does exposure to AI have a learning or a de-skilling effect? Anecdotally, we've been thinking, if you keep using ChatGPT, do you suddenly lose the ability to write emails or be creative? And he wanted to see that happening in a clinical setting. So he did an observational study in Poland amongst endoscopists looking for effectively polyps during colonoscopies. And it's an interesting study. It's observational, so you can't attribute causation here, but he looked at 3 time periods. So what was the detection rate of these diagnostic folks before AI? What was the diagnostic rate when they had AI? And then what was the diagnostic rate when you got rid of the AI? So they'd been using AI for 3 months, then you took it away. What happened? And what happened was they became 6% worse after having the AI taken away than they were before they even had AI in the first place. Now, you can't attribute causation or anything like that with this sort of study, but it does prompt the question, what the hell is going on? And if we start introducing these tools and technologies into various aspects of health systems, are we monitoring and are we prepared for some of these unintended consequences?
Yes, absolutely right. I think the key word is the monitoring. I think in all aspects, it's important to make sure that we do have the monitoring and we have the safeguards in place. And, there are a number of ways in which AI can be applied. But I think what we need to do is to prioritize those that we really are coming on board to augment and bring in the efficiencies and effectiveness. And it's not only AI for the purposes of AI. There is a very exciting project that we're exploring right now in terms of really trying to put together a whole set of documents, guidelines, policies, standard operating procedures, and clinical guidelines for the whole ministry, and putting this all together into one platform. So for starters, you're just basically removing the fragmentation in terms of documents, and so that you're allowing the key ministry officials to access the documents. So it's more or less like a library. But what it also then presents is the opportunity to actually create a knowledge base that can then be used by a context-specific chatbot. So your retrieval, you're using graph retrieval augmented generation to actually pick from that knowledge base and be in a position to inform the policymakers. But much more interestingly, you actually have the opportunity to also have health workers in the front line pick from the clinical guidelines. So they have guidelines in their pocket and they're able to interact with the chatbot. Now, the safeguards come in place. You need to actually be monitoring. So what we're doing with this platform is that we included as part of this test site where, for example, we've got the essential drug lists for the country, which is also part of this knowledge base. And we're using a test to actually see whether it is really picking up the correct guidance from this drug list that is provided. So for all your medicines, for each particular condition, you've got what's supposed to be prescribed and how that is supposed to be administered. So that's really an area that is very sensitive, and you can use that for a test. So up until a certain point in time where you're saying this model is performing, then that's when you can then allow for that interaction. You can now be more confident that the health worker at the front line can use this without necessarily having those unintended consequences. And obviously, they have to be supported again by a clear outline of what action is supposed to be taken. What is the decision rule? You are not basing really on actually treating the patient from the chatbot. Basically, there are certain aspects that you're supposed to get support for, but you need to also put in place the safeguards.
Fascinating, Chenjerai. Maybe a question for you, because you're kind of closer to the action than I am. One tension that we've seen is often in low and middle income countries, teams building AI for health solutions on top of large general purpose models. For example, there's an organization called Penda Health did a collaboration with OpenAI on building a clinical decision support system in Kenya. And on one hand, small private clinic, relatively small study and evaluation. But when you look at just the costs of running the model and the kind of sovereignty issues, kind of wonder, is that the kind of thing that will scale to multiple clinics and sites? But there's obviously going to be a little bit of a trade-off between size of model, sovereignty of model, capability of model. And folks need to now start thinking about, where in that sort of space do they want to be playing? Do you want to make a bet on smaller open source models where you can maintain sovereignty? Do you want to ride the wave of, these massive capability increases that we seem to be seeing in big kind of commercial models? I'm just curious how you're seeing that play out closer to the ground.
Sure. That's an area that really needs full reflection, because often I've gone into conferences and seminars where I think there's just generally this belief that it is very difficult to actually have the low and middle income countries develop models that are context specific. But largely, I think they're basically looking at starting from scratch with the large model within the local context. And yet there is an opportunity actually to leverage the existing foundational models, but have a mechanism in which you can utilize local data to train your own local specific models. So you can have approaches like your transfer learning and other techniques that can make use of those existing models that are out there, but then make sure that you run those on the local models and build your own local specific models. So it brings in the whole concept of small AI. And I think that's the direction that we would want to be looking at countries really developing. Of course, in some unique cases, it might be worthwhile to actually look at really building a big foundational model. But in most of the cases that we are looking at, and we've proven that with a paper that we published in 2023, where we actually just trained a model and around 510 chest X-ray images, and we had performance that was basically above 96% accuracy and a recall of around 99%. And basically, we were looking at putting in place a pipeline that would build on the transfer learning, and we use those weights and we train on the images that are locally. But then there are certain approaches or techniques that you also need to apply, because with 510 images, it's a small data set. So you can do your augmentation and various techniques that will then allow for addressing that issue of the small size. You also do some enhancements of the images and so forth to make sure that they have good quality. But it is certainly possible for the LMICs to build their own local models that are actually scalable. I think the limitation, therefore, would be if we are going to be looking, like in our case, we were looking at one radiology center, this might not really be that generalizable. So we'll fall into the same kind of challenge. But rather, it's important that you can have really a more generalizable data set from across the country, for example, but doesn't necessarily have to be huge. You can still train a model locally, which can actually be applied in the hospital settings. And one area that has also been very interesting that's been coming up is instead of your classic deep learning and your classic machine learning, so we've transitioned into really coming up with these hybrid models that look at both deep learning and machine learning. That way, it becomes light. But at the same time, there's a whole field of topological data analysis, the mammograph analysis that has also proven to enhance performance of your deep learning architectures. And these are areas where I think a lot more research needs to be done to make sure how that they can be applied within our local context. And we develop those models, fit those models in clinical decision support systems, and therefore can be applied within our local context.
Yeah, no, gosh, lots to think about there, Chenjerai. I completely agree with your assertion that the sort of surprise at the prospect of low and middle income countries building their own models or tuning their own models is just completely unwarranted. I wouldn't counsel anyone at this point really to get into the business of building their own foundation models for scratch. And between Quen and Llama and a whole bunch of the other big open foundation models, people have a huge, powerful starting point. So focusing on high quality data curation, data pipelines, and fine tuning of these architectures seem to be where the sweet spot is, and that seems to be where a lot of research is heading. To your point, the methodological innovations that could be interesting for specialist use cases are also really where I'd be putting energy rather than training ever bigger models. In the world of structural biology, which we operate in more on the research side, things like physics-based machine learning models or physics-informed machine learning models are starting to show promise, because there's only so much training data you can generate and throw at these things until you say, actually, if we constrain this space with just some rules of how the world actually works, you will naturally find some solutions that are plausible rather than going wild, how many of these certainly diffusion-based models tend to do. So yeah, completely agree on that front. I mean, the other related thing that we bump into is the question of languages as well. So for me, my favorite example of certainly African-built machine learning models is Lalapa AI, which is a team, I think, based in South Africa, who've built a family of African language models. They have a commercial business around them, which is largely around marketing and digital content and that kind of thing. But they want to use that commercial model to power these open models for all sorts of sectors to use. And again, I'm curious how you see that playing out in clinical settings or in healthcare settings, because of course you want to be interacting, whether you're the clinician or a patient, with many of these systems in not just a language that's familiar to you, but like a cultural context that's familiar to you. We certainly see that as important and have a bunch of initiatives supporting that, but curious to hear how you see that playing out.
Very interesting. Only a couple of days ago, I was actually watching a presentation by a young Zimbabwean based in South Africa who is a co-founder of a company that actually we're doing some work on this. And basically, what I found interesting is that the acknowledgement that it is important to actually be aware of the cultural nuances that also come along with the languages. And I think it's really good work that we are seeing with the number of companies that are now getting into that space, because indeed, I think reference was being made that Africa is only being represented with only about 1%. And so they're looking at really expanding and making sure that there is presence of these languages out there. What's important, and I think they're also coming in on a commercial way. I think what's important is really around the scale accessibility of these, and as much as possible, the data collection that would really show a correct and accurate reflection of the local context that these languages are supposed to be representing. Because it's not only about the letters, it's really about how people come across. Some words that have different meanings in different settings. And so it's really going to be important. Within the healthcare setting, it's even more important that I think that data collection process also involves the domain experts. So it's not only looking at general population in terms of what sort of languages they're speaking, but you need to engage with the domain experts in terms of how they put across, how they communicate. But beyond the domain experts, the general population that use the service, the users, the beneficiaries clinicians themselves in terms of what they would be looking out for. So I see such models reflecting at different phases, and how they can be applied might actually have also different users. But I think it's a promising field, which I would obviously continue to encourage, that at least at the end of the day, when we are looking at from models to policy and practice, we do have that particular arm. Of course, there's always been this question, like other contexts, where mainly it is English that is being spoken. But there has always also been a very good counter argument that, well, it is mainly English as the business language, but at the same time, you find that the conversing that normally takes place within these clinical settings may actually be just a natural mix of these languages. And so if we do have models that go to that expertise, I think they'll be valuable. They can be useful in terms of really transmitting information and engaging at that level. But this also extends to the project that I was referring to, because predominantly right now, most of the aspects that we are focusing on in terms of the guidelines, policies, the clinical standard operating procedures, they are basically being provided for in English. But then another layer that would be interesting is to have that service of the translation services. And I think that can build on the work that these companies are exploring.
I'm curious about the infrastructure in play here, because one of the biggest problems, as you both touched upon, is the data quality issue. Of course, if you are throwing these models into the clinical space, you need to make sure that there's the appropriate infrastructure in order to be able to support the models. You also need to make sure that there's the appropriate infrastructure to be able to collect the data, to be able to make the data better quality, use it for model training. And as you touched upon, there's also the requirements that the government imposes on what you can or can't do with the data. So are there any barriers here, or do you feel like there are certain aspects that are really smooth sailing? What does this look like?
I'm happy to give you my perspective quickly, like infrastructure to collect, deploy, and like govern these systems. To sort of summarize, on the collection side of things, I mean, if I stick with sub-Saharan Africa for a moment, just because we've done a bunch of work there, there doesn't appear to be much in the way of like systematic infrastructure, particularly for low resource language data collection. Maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, we created a thing called the Lacuna Fund, which was one of the early mechanisms for financing language data collection. And we funded about 25 projects for low resource language collection. Fast forward to maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I got to know a little bit about the challenges of collecting data on a language like Chenjerai in Malawi. Now, that's a language that has something like 12 million native speakers. It's probably understood by a few more, but when you compare it with mainstream European languages or Asian languages, there's such a tiny amount of existing digital Chenjerai out there. And that does exist. It's often going to be newspaper clippings and adverts and radio clips and social media posts and whatnot. So not particularly high quality or diverse training data as well. So the effort required to create a high quality label training data set for that language that, to Chenjerai's point, also captures the cultural nuances of that language as well. We've not made any literary references now, but often you communicate in metaphor or analogy or familiar kinds of phrases. To capture that sort of nuance is really quite hard. So to my knowledge, there isn't any systematic infrastructure for doing that. But it's the kind of thing that, I know folks at organizations like UNESCO are trying to think about. What do sovereign digital assets of a nation look like, and treating your linguistic and cultural history as a sovereign asset that can be hoovered up by AI sounds kind of horrible, but in some ways it's the only way to kind of preserve your linguistic and cultural identity in the world of AI. Maybe to touch briefly on the other 2 points on the deployment and governance side, infrastructure for deployment of these models is starting to emerge. I mean, in the UK, there's a brilliant team that's built a product called Newton's Tree, which effectively is a piece of middleware that sits in a hospital that below it, it plugs into all of the data systems in a hospital. And on top of it, you deploy whatever AI model you need to deploy. So model developers just target one, if you like, platform, namely Newton's Tree, rather than having to plumb into all of the one-by-one hospital systems. That also gives you a level of monitoring, oversight, version control, all those sorts of things. Again, I'm not aware of those sorts of things being used widely internationally, but that's the kind of thing that you want to see. And then lastly, I think, we do need to think about what is the digital or AI equivalent of pharmacovigilance. I want to know over the course of a year, what is the diagnostic performance of this new tool been? How are we seeing population level model drift, or are we seeing all these sorts of things? And I don't know of any regulators who have properly either thought that through or deployed systems that help with that. I'm curious what you're seeing, Chenjerai.
I like to look at it First of all, by taking a step back and look at what the landscape has been on the digital health side in particular, one would want to look at it in three buckets. So you've got the foundational bucket, where you have had a lot of investments over the years on infrastructure for digital health. And then you've got a functional bucket where you're basically talking about, you know what, let's make use data for decision making. So a lot of the analytics would fall into that space. And then you've got the frontier bucket, which is mainly focused on the emerging technologies, the AI, the blockchain. And so most countries, you would note that they advanced to some extent on the foundational aspect, but we are mainly looking at your electronic health records, you're mainly looking at your DHIS2 and several other systems. And the main talk around that has been really about interoperability across the system to make sure that you're going to harness the whole data pipeline. But within that, if you want to look at the frontier side has been looking about model development. But on the deployment side, it has to rely a lot on also the foundational side, that is the infrastructure. The infrastructure part on deployment of AI has not really quite advanced, although you have some unique cases where you have, for example, a country like Zimbabwe, there is a supercomputer that's in place that is being underutilized, presents itself with a lot of potential to actually make use of model development and deployment itself. The training of models can actually be facilitated by such infrastructure. But there's a lot more investments required in that area. And that's why I'm really glad that in most cases, when you look at the national AI strategies that are now being developed, there is a piece that also looks at that aspect on the infrastructure that is really required. But with what is already available, you find that it is very much possible to actually deploy some of the very small AI that I was referring to. And that should not really stop model development and deployment within the current context and the infrastructure that has already been set up. One of the things that I do note as well is that on the language side, and as Tariq indicated, there is very little that is really been properly harnessed and structured out there. And the part of that data collection is to take place. But there's also an opportunity for innovation in terms of how you can collect that data. For example, during COVID, we found ourselves, when we're doing some field studies, we found ourselves leveraging your WhatsApp, for example, through the WhatsApp group, and we could actually do a WhatsApp facilitated focus group discussion with the village health workers out there. Most of them are now able to actually be doing that. So you can have those conversations. There can be a deliberate conversation around the local languages that can be done in a very widespread network of WhatsApp groups, and you can actually collect that information. Unstructured data, but there are processes in terms of how you can actually build on that unstructured data so that you can actually label, categorize, and then make use of in the model development pipeline. So the opportunities are there. There's an entry point for innovations. There's an entry point to leverage other existing tools that are there to also collect the data that would be required for really context-specific models.
In the deployed models that you've seen so far, what does that infrastructure look like at this very moment? So the clinics that you are seeing success in, what kind of tools are they using? Did they build it themselves? How did they build it themselves? Any detail that you have there?
Sure. I can start off with an example of what we did in terms of model development. So the model we developed for COVID-19 classification performed very well. We're very much interested in seeing how this hybrid model and also a topological machine learning enhanced hybrid model could fare. And it was really doing very well in terms of performance. But the next step was to see how do you integrate this within a clinical decision support system. So the initial work that we're now exploring was just uploading this. So we developed an RShiny application, an interactive web dashboard that would then allow for an upload of the chest X-ray image, and then also link that to a multimodal model, which would then allow for reading through the chest X-ray. But the first part is the classification being based on the model that we have deployed our RShiny framework with. And this is the model that we have developed. It's very light in itself, so can really sit on a web application. And then link that to another model that would then just do the write-up. It's more or less like a radiology report that is now being produced. And then there are recommendations based on the local clinical guidelines of what is supposed to be done, and then would be recommended. So we're at a stage of really trying to see with the domain experts, the radiologists, radiographers, the nurses, the doctors, just to find out the applicability of this kind of approach. It's more of an iterative process of fine-tuning that. I know, for example, in Malawi, there is some work that is going on there where they already have a pre-packaged classification model that has come through. One of my key earlier questions was to say, is this based on local data, given my interest in that research? But they then did indicate that it is really building on, of course, a foundational model. And then with the new data that is coming through, they're basically training new local data. I'm not aware of the level of performance it has been working, but I think it's something that the ministry itself is proud of, having noted some of the public comments and also the blogs that have been done relating to that work. So there is an opportunity. There are various other initiatives that I've also come across in which it will be a clinical decision support system, but not fully AI enabled. So it is more or less like a stepwise guidance on, say, if you see this in this child, then basically do this. And it is that kind of a platform that can quickly benefit from enabling it through AI, and a lot more functions can actually be included. So what I'm witnessing is some progress in acceptance of these AI-enabled tools within the health care settings. A lot more is still need to be done in terms of making sure that the decision rules and the processes that follow thereafter are really well documented and there's clarity in terms of the processes. But generally, it's a promising area with various other initiatives. We've basically been discussing with colleagues within the sector that it would really be great to actually just have a compendium of use cases within the various different ministries across countries where AI could be applied. And that way, it can start the process or the conversation with the policymakers and also gather the interest that is required to drive the policy related to that.
Is the policy currently a blocker at all?
Not necessarily. What I've witnessed in a couple of countries is that the policy is really coming in at a national level and then flows down. And so for countries that have really worked on developing their AI strategies or AI policies at a national level, normally housed within the ministries of ICT, of technology and so forth, it becomes easier for line ministries to also then implement. It has been a conversation before where people would say, okay, we are talking AI, but has this already been guided through the national policy? In Zimbabwe, I see a lot of warming up to AI in various spaces because the country is actually finalizing its national AI strategy. And there's been a lot of consultation around that. There's been a lot of communication around it. So people are aware the government is really going ahead in that direction. It makes it easy for stakeholders to be at ease and progress accordingly.
Just to add on how are these tools being deployed, going back to the original example Chenjerai gave of TB detection, the trial that Wellcome supported was of a software system called CAD for TB, built by a team in the Netherlands. And that's gone through several iterations over time. But I think image-based diagnostic systems are a little bit easy because you've got things like the DICOM standard, which is a standard way of like chucking out images from medical devices. So at least the CAD4DB system, it can actually be installed on the workstation for modern Canon systems. And with a whole bunch of other systems, it's just running on a laptop plugged into the scanner. And then over time, they've built various workflow tools that let you plug it into other bits and pieces. So if you have a hospital medical information management system, it can API itself into there. I think the latest version even has something like you can just share the results of something with a QR code on WhatsApp, which gives you a window into how some data management is done, right? That's the reality. If you want to give the result to someone, you send it to them on WhatsApp. But that's giving you one example of a probably pretty mature space. AI for image diagnostics is at a minimum a decade old. So folks have been thinking about this stuff for a while. But when it comes to other workflows, particularly integrating with like laboratory information management systems or those sorts of things, there's a lot more heterogeneity there. So it's harder to have this kind of clean, I'll basically plumb something into the thing that's spitting out an image.
And is the goal for any of these to also eventually integrate them into electronic health record systems?
Depending on what you mean by electronic health record system, clinical decision support systems are typically sitting at the layer where if you were my doctor and you were diagnosing me with some condition as you're entering it into the forms that build up the EHR, the clinical decision support system may pop up a message saying, are you sure he's pregnant? Or something like that. Or, are you sure you want to give him an antibiotic for his sort of sneezing fit? That kind of thing. So I've seen that sort of interaction with the EHR systems. At the other end, of course, using AI tools for large-scale analysis of health records, particularly when they're integrated and connected with other multimodal data. We're definitely seeing a bit of that. But maybe I'm just not being creative enough, but that's where I see the immediate prospects.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Those layers really provide some practical approaches to applying AI within the EHR. So really popping up and really informing the clinician on perhaps steps to take, or really just making them be aware of certain processes that they obviously would know, but it's possible that they might miss out. So it's really about trying to ensure that there is enhanced quality of care within that system. But then also the EHR is presenting a huge body of data as well. And so there's a lot more that can be done with AI in terms of really getting the patterns. So one of the initiatives that has been done in several countries in performance-based financing, where you find facilities actually receive some subsidy financing based on the utilization of services, the services that they provide, as well as the quality aspect. You'd find that such programs generally have been supported by a very rigorous verification of whether those services were provided or whether there was good quality indeed. So quality is assessed, and then conditional to that quality, a payment is made. But right now, you find that because you've got these electronic health record systems, they present an opportunity to actually do those quality assessments based on the data that's coming through. So instead of actually going with a checklist to check whether the pregnant woman had a urine sample taken and so forth, basically all that data is within the EHR, and you can do your quality assessments from that, and that can really significantly lower costs associated with verifications. That is a big plus, especially when we are seeing a change in the financing landscape for the health sector globally. You want to find ways in which you can be a bit more efficient, and that's where AI holds promise as well in supporting, beyond obviously providing that direct clinical support or decisions by the clinician.
And just to add there on efficiency, and going back to my other point of AI is good, but if you can get away without using AI, even better. There's a great platform in the UK called Open Prescribing, which all it does is publish in an open, almost like league table, the prescribing behavior of all primary care sites in the UK. And what it does, it lets you ask the question, is this clinic versus that clinic prescribing more generics versus more expensive branded drugs when the generic has been recommended, or what else is going on? Because regardless of if a health system is communicating to GPs saying you need to start prescribing this lower priced one because it works as well and it saves money, that message just may not get through to people. But if they get a little letter comparing you with your neighboring surgery saying, actually, you seem to be costing us twice as much money for doing the same job, that's a useful motivator to get people to change their behavior. So I think the smart application of data with communication and the right incentives can do all sorts of things. If AI can make that even better, cool. But I mean, to start with a bit of name and shame like that as well, if useful.
That's really interesting. That's also a pre-built AI governance system that's outcome-based there that you can also use to inform and train models, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The more you look at it, as data presents itself within the various systems that we have, there are options in terms of really seeing where the gains can be provided by AI automation, AI models, and predictive models. And as much as possible, what's critical is to look at, okay, what is it that we want to achieve at the end of the day? So it's not really building models for the purpose of building models, but being objective oriented. That's what is going to be critical, and that I've seen allows for then a structured process of looking at which point do you want to come in with a particular approach, and that way also brings the efficiencies in your own pipeline. You find units within ministries of health or within the health sector in general, entities that are there have different needs, and important to really kind of really scope out and see, okay, if we want to achieve an overall gain with regards to maybe how we are running the sector and improving efficiencies, then you can actually identify the spots you would want to enter. One of the things that is really critical at this point, I mentioned at some point that there's a shift in the health financing landscape. And so one of the areas that has really been discussed at length is really about enhancing domestic financing for health, governments investing more in health. But at the same time, a critical area has been around prioritization. And there are certain approaches that one can think of in terms of how best do you optimize the health outcomes of a nation? And if we've got a limited envelope, and how do you split that envelope such that you're going to invest in the right interventions to get the best outcomes of interest? And now, while some of those aspects can actually be addressed, as Tariq indicated, with non-AI approaches, and you could do the mathematical modeling and identify ways in which you could come to that answer. But then within the pipelines of that modeling and so forth, you can also work on optimization techniques that build on on AI. So I think it's a question of really looking at techniques that really are focused on saying what is it that we want to solve. And I would presume that most countries at this present moment are actually thinking of ways in which they could better prioritize, ways in which they could really have allocative efficiencies given the challenges that are now pressing. And there are opportunities for health financing experts, the health economists to work together with mathematical modelers, the AI experts to come up with the solutions that are really appropriate for low and middle income countries that can be applied as soon as possible.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, in addition to those sorts of medium to long-term structural optimizations, there's also, of course, the prospect of nearer term forecasting as well. At Wellcome, we have an interest in the health impacts of climate change, and changing climate patterns have an impact on disease as well. Just thinking about heat, rainfall, and vectors like mosquitoes, we can see that if it's going to be hotter and rainier, the likelihood of mosquitoes is going to be higher, which is going to in turn lead to a greater incidence of dengue or whatever. This year was when the US had its first case of domestic malaria transmission. You've got dengue happening in Southern Europe now too. So, Wellcome, we're funding a couple of these climate-sensitive infectious disease early warning systems, including rigorous evaluations and trials of these. The idea is either one of these AI models, can you, rather than having, like a week's notice about something bad going to happen, can you have a month's notice so you can start to take preventative action, spraying, getting rid of standing water, pre-deploying medication, that kind of thing. But all these sorts of interventions can help both improve a health system and ultimately improve health outcomes for folks.
Just recalled when you mentioned the economic impacts of climate change, I just reflected on a particular use case that just popped up. An agency was really interested in looking at the economic impacts of family planning, and it just bumped into some terms of reference that we're looking into it. And I went through these and I said, okay, wait a minute. Let me just work on developing a model that could actually work, and a platform that could be AI enabled to actually address this question. I was just really curious because it's an area that I'm also quite interested in terms of health financing. And worked on this, and I was really amazed. I think the terms of reference were quite detailed, so they were also specifying some of the mathematical models they are preferring. I ended up packaging this together, and I was like, okay, with a colleague from that agency, they say, guys, when you eventually get your guy to do this work, you might find this useful. You can also leverage on this platform and actually get some insights into it. And so I think it's those kind of areas where increasingly we are going to see some of the technical assistance work being supported or augmented, if I may say, by platforms that are AI enabled. And what that would mean is that would drastically shorten the periods or the turnaround times for some of the work that you would expect to see. And what that also benefits is really, at the end of the day, the more you're going to be getting policy advisory or technical advisory and shorter turnaround time, the policymakers are going to be able to make agile decisions. And that's an area we want to look at beyond the clinical setting at the health systems strengthening level. There are really interesting opportunities there to really be efficient in terms of the policy advisory that that individuals and entities can provide to clients like the government and other agencies.
Yeah, agreed. And maybe just riffing on that, Chenjerai, I think the use of AI in research more broadly is something that we're seeing a lot of. There's a program that it's a very long name, but it hopefully describes what it is. It's called the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative. And it's really a program to make the business of producing living evidence syntheses on any topic from health to agriculture to economic policy much easier to do. Right now, it takes a huge amount of time and effort to conduct these living evidence syntheses, which bring together the best available knowledge and research on a topic to inform a policy choice or an implementation decision. And if we can get to the point where using AI to either make the data infrastructure work better or synthesize insights better, you do ultimately end up making better decisions because they're based on all of the available evidence. That's also just a win for everyone, particularly when the questions are either tough questions, the answers are locked up in non-traditional data sources. It might be like some tiny little analysis someone's written on a blog somewhere versus a peer-reviewed scientific journal presented at some policy conference. These are also some of these interesting opportunities for AI to play a role when it comes to health equity. I mean, just as an example, right now, if you if you're a health minister in Kenya and you ask the question, what are the best bang for my buck, value for money investments that help mitigate the effects of climate change while also providing health benefits. There is no easy answer to that. But having that answer is really, really, really valuable. And those answers are starting to emerge out there. But unless you're literally the person conducting that research, you're never going to get that in front of a policymaker. So that's the other real potential we see here.
Thanks for that, Tariq. I'm actually going to look up that site. I totally agree with you that the more we actually have agile decision making, the better. And you're right that some of the policymakers have no access to some of that information. More and more, if we do leverage AI, we might be in a position to set up really proper systems that can provide for evidence that is required for decision making.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for that brilliant discussion. Any final words you want to leave our audience?
Well, thanks, Patricia. I mean, it's really been great here having this conversation, and I think it's really timely. We're at a time where most of the lower middle income countries are really taking up AI and emerging technologies, and it's important to continue with these conversations so that at least we tap into the talent that is local and also build on local data and to have context-aware systems that can support the policymakers and other decision makers. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that. And thanks so much, Patricia and Chenjerai, for letting me spend some time with you both. My takeaway would really be to just maintain some optimism in this space. I think it's very easy to, particularly at the moment, be a little bit disillusioned by AI and big tech and all these subjects. And occasionally, you'll roll your eyes at, oh, look, someone wants to deploy some AI system in a clinical setting. It's very complicated. It can't possibly work. I think it can. We've got to think about it pretty hard and we've got to rigorously evaluate it, but just maintain that optimism, because the promise of these tools is really great. And we have to very carefully get to that promise. But unless you keep an open mind and maintain some optimism, you're going to potentially miss out on a sort of huge upside for a lot of people. So that'd be my takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Before you go, a quick note about the company I co-founded, Private AI. We help organizations use their data safely so they can build compliant AI products, share data securely, and extract insights without the regulatory headaches. If PII, PHI, or PCI data are standing between you and your next innovation, visit private-ai.com. See you next time on the Data Frontier.